The billionaire invited the black janitor as a joke, but he showed up like a king, and the whole room froze when they found out who he really was. Darius Cole had been invisible for years. Every day, he swept the marble floors of Aldrich Capital's skyscraper, nodded silently to men in $1,000 suits, and kept his head down. To them, he was just the janitor, a background figure in their gleaming empire. What they didn't know was that Darius watched everything. He listened. He remembered. And when billionaire Preston Aldridge sent him a gold-trimmed invitation to the firm's private black-tie gala, everyone in the office laughed. It wasn't a real invitation, it was a joke. A cruel, polished insult wrapped in luxury cardstock. "Let's see if he actually shows up," Preston smirked, his friends snickering behind their champagne flutes. No one expected him to. Why would he? But on the night of the gala, the laughter stopped. The valet line paused as a sleek Maybach rolled up the estate driveway. Out stepped Darius, not in overalls, but in a velvet tuxedo sharper than anything in the room. His presence cut through the air like a blade. Heads turned, phones lowered, and Preston, standing at the top of the marble staircase, blinked once then again, because this wasn't the janitor he'd mocked. This was someone else entirely. And the moment Darius met his eyes, everything started to shift. And no one was ready for what he was about to say. The silence in the ballroom stretched thin. Darius didn't rush. He moved through the room with a calm that felt dangerous, like a man who already knew how the night would end. Preston tried to laugh it off. "Well, look who decided to show," he called out, voice tight with fake charm. His friends forced polite smiles, their eyes scanning Darius for weakness, something to mock. But there was nothing. The suit fit like royalty. The watch on his wrist? Limited edition. And the men flanking him? Not just guests, private security. Preston's wife whispered something to him, but he didn't hear it. He was too busy wondering how a janitor got access to that kind of money. A server passed with champagne. Darius didn't take a glass. Instead, he stepped onto the platform by the grand piano, the kind of move only Preston or a keynote speaker would dare. People murmured. Darius held up a small envelope. "Since I was invited," he said, voice steady, "I thought I'd bring a gift." A few chuckled nervously. Preston forced another smile. "Let's hear it then," he said, trying to regain control. But when Darius opened the envelope, it wasn't a gift, it was a file. Names, accounts, transactions. And on the front page, Aldrich Capital, confidential. And that's when Preston's face finally changed. Preston's grin didn't just fade, it collapsed. His hand twitched at the sight of that file, and suddenly the room's energy shifted. The wealthy elite, once sipping cocktails and trading fake compliments, were now leaning in, watching. Because Darius didn't just bring papers, he brought proof. "Years ago," Darius began, voice calm but heavy, "a young developer sold a back-end security system to Aldrich Capital. That system tripled your firm's portfolio protection." A few heads nodded. They remembered. But that developer was pushed out. No contract honored. No credit given, just erased. Someone whispered, "Is he talking about himself?" Preston stepped forward, sweating under the lights. "That's ancient history," he snapped. "Nobody even remembers that guy's name." Darius didn't flinch. "Funny," he replied, "because the IRS will remember yours." He held up another page, offshore accounts, fake shell companies, tax fraud, all tied to Preston, signed by his hand. Gasps scattered through the room. Someone's champagne glass hit the floor. And Preston, who always controlled the room, suddenly looked like a man drowning in his own house. But Darius wasn't done. He'd only opened the first folder. Preston tried to speak, but Darius raised a hand. Not loud, not aggressive, just the final. The room obeyed him now. 2 years ago, Darius continued, I started buying shares of Aldrich Capital, quietly, through silent partners, small percentages, nothing big enough to notice. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You taught me that trick, Preston. Hide things in plain sight. Someone in the crowd, a board member, suddenly looked pale. He pulled out his phone, checking something. Then another did the same. And then a third. The realization was a domino, falling fast. Preston wasn't just being exposed, he was being replaced. "I now own 51% of this company," Darius said, holding up a notarized document. The room erupted gasps, murmurs, a few people clapping before realizing they shouldn't. Preston's wife backed away from him, slowly. A security guard near the exit touched his earpiece. Preston lunged forward, wild-eyed, reaching for the papers. But Darius stepped aside. Preston stumbled. The image of a billionaire losing control, literally tripping in his own mansion, was something no one would forget. Darius looked down at him, voice still calm. "You built an empire by stepping on people like me. Now let's see how well you survive underneath it." The tension in the room was suffocating. Preston stayed on the floor for a second too long, like his body hadn't caught up with his mind. When he finally stood, his voice cracked. "This is a setup," he spat. "You're bluffing. There's no way." But the board members weren't listening. One of them, an older man who'd backed Preston for over a decade, turned to Darius and said, "Is it true? Are you the new majority?" Darius didn't answer. He didn't need to. He simply handed him the folder, the real one marked shareholder transfer agreements. Signed, sealed, timed perfectly. Then came the real twist. Darius motioned to a young woman standing quietly near the edge of the room, his lawyer. She stepped forward and placed a laptop on the piano. On screen, a live Zoom call. Government officials, auditors, a federal investigator. Preston's face turned ghost white. "This is a private event," he yelled, but his voice cracked. The investigator spoke calmly. "Mr. Aldridge, we've reviewed the files Mr. Cole provided. Your firm is now under investigation for securities fraud, tax evasion, and IP theft. You may want to contact your legal team." The entire room stared at Preston, the man who always controlled the story, as he finally lost the narrative. And Darius hadn't even touched the most personal part yet. Preston's hands were shaking now, barely hiding it behind clenched fists. The guests, his inner circle, investors, even his own brother-in-law, were already backing away, murmuring. Darius stepped down from the platform and walked slowly toward the massive oil painting hanging over the fireplace, a portrait of Preston in a power stance, flanked by gold trim, the symbol of his dominance. Darius stared at it. "You spent millions building this image," he said softly. "Built a reputation on arrogance, exclusivity, and control. But it was all a mask." He turned to face the crowd. "You see that painting? The day that portrait was unveiled, I was in a cheap motel, watching the launch of the software Preston's company claimed as theirs. Code I wrote, patents I filed. But my name? Scrubbed." Preston lunged forward again, but this time 2 security guards, his own, stepped between him and Darius. The betrayal hit like a slap. Darius walked calmly to the center of the room and pulled a remote from his pocket. With a click, a projector lit up the wall behind him. Dozens of documents, emails, legal files, even surveillance footage from the company's archives, all showing Preston's manipulation, years of theft and silencing. The room didn't gasp this time. It just went dead quiet. And for the first time in his life, Preston Aldridge was no longer feared, he was pitied. But Darius wasn't after pity, he was after justice. Darius looked out over the stunned crowd, but he wasn't focused on them anymore. His eyes locked on Preston, and his voice dropped lower, heavier. "You ever wonder why I disappeared?" he asked. "Why I never sued? Never spoke out?" Preston didn't answer. He couldn't. Darius continued. "Because you didn't just steal my code, you went after my family. You threatened the investors who backed me. You leaked a fake scandal to the media. My sister lost her scholarship. My father lost his pension. All because you didn't want a black man getting credit for your success." Murmurs rippled through the room again. But this time they weren't just shocked, they were horrified. Preston's wife turned away, disgusted. A reporter who had been live tweeting the event stopped typing, frozen. Darius paused, letting it sink in. "I could have fought back then, but I had nothing. No power, No money, just shame. So, I vanished. Took jobs no one noticed. I became what you expected me to be, invisible. He looked down, then back up, sharper now. But I didn't disappear. I evolved. I learned the system, and I used it better than you ever did. Preston looked like a man watching his own obituary being written in real time. And Darius hadn't even raised his voice. Because this wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning. The silence was no longer just shock, it was fear. Not of Darius, but of everything Preston had hidden. The guests weren't whispering now, they were texting lawyers, stepping outside to make calls, distancing themselves from a man who was crumbling before their eyes. One investor, pale and sweating, muttered, "If half of this is true, we're all exposed." Darius heard him. "It's all true," he said. "And don't worry, I've already sent full disclosures to the SEC, the press, and every shareholder." Then came the final hit. Darius stepped aside, and his lawyer returned this time with a stack of signed resignations. Preston's executive board had flipped. Every last one. The signatures were fresh. The titles revoked. Preston wasn't just out of power, he was out of the company. "You can't do this," Preston roared, pushing past security. "This is my legacy." Darius didn't flinch. He leaned in, his voice low. "Your legacy was built on silence, on fear, on taking from those who couldn't fight back." He held up a single worn photo, a snapshot of Darius at a whiteboard years ago, teaching the very system Preston stole. "But I remember everything, and now so will they." Suddenly, a photographer's flash went off, then another, then a dozen more. The media, once kept outside, had entered. Cameras captured Preston sweaty, red-faced, shouting nonsense, while Darius stood calm, composed, unmoved. And in that single frame, the story rewrote itself. As the flashes continued, and Preston was quietly escorted out by his own security team, Darius didn't gloat. He didn't raise his arms in triumph or demand applause. He just stood still, surrounded by everything that was once used to humiliate him and now belonged to him. The mansion, the company, the room, the narrative. People began approaching him carefully, almost reverently. A junior analyst whispered, "I used to see you in the lobby. I thought you were just the janitor." Darius nodded once. "You weren't wrong," he said. "I was the janitor. I just wasn't only that." He walked slowly to the grand piano, the same place Preston had made so many of his smug toasts over the years. And instead of gloating, Darius tapped his glass once. The room went still. "I don't want your praise," he said quietly. "I want your attention. Look around. This empire was built on the backs of the unheard, the overlooked, the stolen from. That ends tonight." The crowd didn't cheer. They stood in stunned, almost reverent silence. Some were ashamed. Others were inspired. But no one looked at Darius the same again. Because he hadn't just taken down a billionaire. He'd reminded the room and the world that true power doesn't scream. It arrives quietly and changes everything. The night was almost over. The lights had dimmed, the guests were dispersing, and Preston Aldridge, the man who once ruled the room, was now trending online for all the wrong reasons. Handcuffed, screaming, forgotten. But Darius stayed behind, not to celebrate, but to remember. He stood alone in the ballroom, staring out the tall windows at the estate's reflecting pool. His lawyer approached. "You sure you want to do this last part?" she asked. Darius nodded. "Yeah, it matters." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the original invitation, the same gold-trimmed card that was meant to humiliate him. He flipped it over and wrote one name in pen, Angela Cole, his mother. The woman who cleaned houses her whole life, who told him, "Don't ever think you're less just because they treat you that way." He placed the invitation gently on the mantel, under Preston's massive portrait now tilted, cracked from earlier chaos. It was symbolic, a message. The joke invitation had come full circle now, a monument to the man who rose above it all. As he walked out, a reporter caught him at the door. "Mr. Cole, do you have a comment for the press?" Darius smiled slightly, adjusted his cufflink, and said, "Tell them. The janitor just cleaned house." Then he stepped into the Maybach and disappeared into the night, not as a guest, but as the new king. If that ending gave you chills, share this story. They mocked him for cleaning floors, but he cleaned out an empire.